Today, we remove all those nasty, worn out handling components of our NX2000. Welcome back to the Auto Obsessive Garage. Chadwick with you again for another installment of Project NX2K. That's our 1993 Nissan NX2000. Today's episode, guys, is removing all the handling suspension components out of this NX2000. A lot of them original, completely worn out bushings, shocks, you know the drill, 30-year-old car. So let's get those components out of there. That's all we're doing in this episode. The next episode will be installing it, but let me show you guys how to remove all that stuff because it can be a bit tricky, especially if it's been on there for a long time. Let's get in the garage, get a little dirty. Now this worn out, crusty old NX2000 suspension setup is just not going to work for what we intend to do with the car, including probably a rally race if I can get it together in time and some other fun things. So everything's going to come out. What we're doing: installing a new control arm, got an inner steering bellows boot since the other one's torn, sway bar end link, outer tie rod. Now these are your usual wear and tear items. I'm not switching the sway bar in the front. The sway bar on the front's pretty beefy on this car and it has a natural tendency to understeer a little bit from the factory. So I don't want to increase the chance of that happening. So I'm going to keep it as it is, just replace the end link. The biggest thing I'm doing to this car is replacing the worn out strut setup with these Rev 9 coilovers. Now this is a pretty affordable, I'm not going to say cheap, coilover setup, but it did come highly reviewed from folks that run it on the B13 Sentras, the SERs, and other NX2000 owners. So this should be a good setup, allows for adjustability, which we're going to need. Oh, we got a lot to do, guys. Let's start taking this apart. For me, doing a big suspension overhaul like this, I always start with the little stuff. Start with your outer tie rods, you start with your sway bar end links before you go ahead and just drop the control arm. It's good to have that leverage, so if that control arm's still firm, you can use it to pound out these parts. We're going to be obviously using a pickle fork for the tie rod, outer tie rod, and then another sized pickle fork to get the ball joint separated. These tend to stick and they've been on the car for a long time. I'm actually not sure if these control arms have ever been changed. The bushings are completely gone, same with the outer tie rods. So let's go ahead and do that at this time. First thing I'm aiming for, outer tie rod. Pull that retaining pin out. Now we should be able to take that right off. Another thing, don't be afraid of penetrating oil. Get in there really good a couple days even before you start this. You're gonna want all this to come off nice and easy because it can be a bear. 19 millimeters to take the castle nut off of that outer control arm. Castle nut off. You guys know what time it is. Pickle fork time. What do you guys think of that outer tie rod? That thing is roughed up. So we're gonna try to get a pickle fork in there. A little something like this. And what we're gonna do is hammer this thing right in there and kind of pop that out. You don't wanna hammer underneath because it can mess up the threads and get stuck in there pretty awful. I've seen that a few times. You get it just right, that thing's gonna pop right off. Like so. And that, don't have to worry about that bushing, it was dead decades ago. So, outer tie rod, nice and loose. Now, usually when you're replacing these, you can twist them freely off the car. In this case, this one's pretty hard seized up against the nut and against the inner tie rod that threads inside. So we're gonna have to separate this somehow. It was a little tricky when I did the other one, so I'm gonna rest it back into the hole here on the hub. And then I'm gonna go ahead and try to break loose this last nut here. It's a real pain in the butt. So you can see how the outer tie rod's gonna move. There you go, just like so. Sometimes we use some old-fashioned techniques to make things happen here. Hammers tend to fix things, don't they? You can see a little bit of crust in the threads there, and that's what causes that to stick. But what do you guys think about this outer tie rod? How's that look to you? That's not gonna fly. Now you really can't see this on camera, but I'm gonna take the nut off here. And the inner boot here on the inner tie rod, which is kind of steering bellows boot is what it's usually called, is completely split. So I'm gonna pull that off. We're gonna be replacing that. Not too easy to see in there. Oh yeah, it's been broken for a while, I can tell. There is a little joint in there, obviously, and grease will come out, so it shouldn't come off in sections. That's your first indicator. Yeah, there's a little twist tie in there I need to undo, so I'm gonna climb under the car and undo that this time. Now, if you gaze into that cavern, you can see the joint that we need to clean up and grease. I'm gonna pull the rest of this boot off too. Yeah, that's not doing too much. This is what our inner bellows boot looked like. Not able to hold that grease in, that's for sure. See the joint there? We're gonna get in there, clean it up, re-grease it. After cleaning out the old joint and putting in new grease, you just wanna put globs of your new grease in there and move your inner tie rod around a little bit to get that grease worked in. You don't need a lot for this one, but it will ensure this ball and socket doesn't wear down over time. You can see we're all greased up, ready to go. With that grease in there, we are now time to put that new steering rack bellows on to protect it from getting dirt in there and possibly seizing up or breaking. We've got our old split boot here. Got our fresh new one to put on. This is gonna be nice. Let's go ahead and slide it on at this time. Time to slide that new inner bellows boot on. Okay, and that'll slide into a certain point. With that in there, we can now slide under the vehicle and secure it. And with our happy little boot in there, as you can see, we can go ahead and slide that nut back on so we don't lose that. We're definitely gonna need that later when we put the new outer tie rod on. And now we can continue taking things apart. Next up, let's get the sway bar end link off of there. Sorry about the dramatic lighting, but you can see our sway bar end link right there. It's 14 millimeter on all the nuts and bolts. This front and back one, or side to side one here, needs to have two 14 millimeter wrenches on it because it has a little locking nut here that'll spin freely. Ratcheting gear wrench. Just try to break that loose. Jesus. Boy, that's never been taken off. You can see that will start spinning. There we go. Sorry about that horrible view, but you can see how you have to do this one. For the bottom part, we can just hit it with our impact. I believe it's also a 14 mil. And there's our end link removed. Next up, we can start to take our control arm out. Now, before you do that, you have to drop your sway bar a little bit. It's just clearance. Pulling this rear section of the control arm out while it still has a bushing on there will not clear the stock sway bar. So go ahead and pull those two bolts holding the sway bar bushing in place, and that'll allow the sway bar to drop a little bit, and then we'll be able to get it out. It's not a bad idea too at this time to loosen these two strut tower bolts here, and that's just gonna help us when it comes time to remove it further. So we'll just grab one end like so. Once you pull the nut off, you can kind of just tap out the rest of the bolt there. Nice little hammer will get the job done. There you go. We'll just take them all the way out for now. Hammer taps again. Now at this point you want to get a jack stand to hold up your hub, because once you undo the control arm, that brake assembly and hub is just going to sag down because the only thing connected is going to be your axle. So just get a regular jack stand and hold it up. I'm gonna crawl under there and do the 2 bolts holding the bracket for the sway bar. We'll get that out of there. I believe it's 14 mil. And that'll allow that sway bar just to sag enough so you can get that control arm out when it's time. Now the hardest part about the control arm is actually taking off this lower bolt that holds the ball joint in. So yeah, that ball joint, the top bolt from the ball joint to the axle end is just not enough space to pull that nut off all the way. It's kind of a beast. So let's go ahead and pull that cotter pin out first. Now there isn't enough space with the end of the axle being right there, so you gotta spin it up a little bit, and then when we use our pickle fork here, it'll drop it down. So let's just do that. So we want to get it pretty close to the top, which we are. Now it's more pickle fork time. You want to use the one that's set up for ball joints. It fits a little better. Right there, you can see it drop down. It'll be resting on the nut. At that time, you can go ahead and pull your pickle fork out. And forgot we disconnected all that, so let's get our jack stand in place here. There we go. Ball joint nut removed. Now what's left on our control arm is this rear portion that's kind of sandwiched in. You have to remove 2 bolts, 1 nut to get that off. In the front, you've got a long bolt and nut that pass through right here. I'm gonna go ahead and loosen the rear one first, get those out of there. Gonna use an impact for that. And then this guy's kind of the same deal, just gotta use a wrench and an impact combo, and we should be able to drop that down. Here's that little sandwich plate, the bottom part of it. You can see where the rubber goes, so it kind of traps that big bushing in there. This is the hardware, 2 big bolts there, 17 millimeter, and the nut. That part's gonna be free now. Sometimes that rubber can get seized in there a little bit and you have to hammer it out, but all that's left now is this big guy here. I wanna say it's a 22 millimeter. With that large bolt removed, you can finally get the control arm out, and this is what she looks like. This is that sandwich piece. It's like a big rubber bushing that goes in there. Here's where the long bolt passes through. What do you guys think of this ball joint? Yeah, I'd say it's about time to replace it. Control arms out. Now all we have left are those 3 14 millimeter bolts holding the strut assembly to the car. Here are the 14 millimeter bolts we need to pull out, and then we'll drop the strut assembly down through the wheel well. The strut assembly should be loosened up now. I should be able to just wiggle it free. Make sure you're not hooked on that brake line still. And there we go, strut assembly free from the car. Here at the rear of the NX, doing the rear suspension, good news is it's a lot simpler. This is a front engine, front wheel drive car. All the complicated stuff is usually up front. We still gotta get that strut out of there, replace it with a coilover, and the sway bar and end links is being upgraded. So, let's get to work. Pretty straightforward. 17 millimeter bolts holding the strut in place. 14 millimeter for the end links for that sway bar. Let's get her out. Oh, I'm doing the wrong way, Teddy. How cool is that? Because that would be really hard to do with your hands. This thing's so strong, Theodore. How cool is that? And now this whole thing needs to come out. This is a hard part here. Just 1 second, shh, don't move. This little clip is basically rusted on that holds the brake line in place. And it's a real challenge to get out, so I hit it with some PV Blaster and I tend to shock it with a hammer and a flathead screwdriver. Crusty metal clip removed. Might have to disconnect the end links, but let's see if we have some room here. Oh no, we can just turn it like that. There you go. And our little sway bar is off. Okay, let's take these bolts out of the NX up here. Sometimes they can be a little tough to get out. Okay, now we need to go up in the trunk, and let me show you guys what you need to do up there to access the top of the struts. Access the strut top in the trunk here. You have to remove this plastic panel piece. It's just 3 screws, pretty easy to get to. 2 are mounted under here, kind of tricky to see, and you'll see the one obvious one up top. You remove those, pull that plastic piece out, and then you have access to the top of your strut. So take those 3 out. Those should be the last things holding the strut in. All right, 3 12mm nuts need to be removed. Everything's undone, nothing holding our strut on, but it's still stuck there because, like I said, it does stick to that upper mounting point. So let's just see if we can knock it loose. Oh, yeah, be careful if you're looking up. You're gonna get a lot of dirt and stuff on an older car. You definitely don't want that in your eyes. There we go. As promised, old strut coming out. God, it looks original. Wow, look at all this crust on top.